Hello, in this video I'm going to be looking at the newest Tier 8 Polish tank destroyer, the Grom. This is the only collector / premium tank destroyer from this new Polish tank destroyer tech tree, and of course it does have the same assault shells mechanic as all the other Polish tank destroyers. Which of course it does mean that your damage gets less the further you are from the enemy tank. So let's talk about the tank itself. This tank essentially features the same playstyle and characteristics as the tank destroyers from the tech tree, except it is just slightly better in a few areas, those being its mobility / terrain resistances, its gun depression at 7 degrees, and compared to the tech tree tier 8, the Kilana, it does have a slightly more alpha for a worse reload time. But let's just get right into its stats. There will be a review on my website later. It's not ready yet because Wargaming did only give us the tank yesterday, and since then all I've been doing is playing it, and I haven't actually been writing up the full review yet. But there will be one up fairly soon, hopefully. But here you can see the armor profile of the Grom. You can see against 225mm AP, which is fairly normal heavy tank penetration in tier 8, it has no real frontal weak points other than the lower plate and cupola. Its upper plate and its whole shoulders are really completely impenetrable, and that's even when the tank turns to the side, which cannot be said about the tier 10 NC70. As many of you who have played it will know, the cheeks on that thing are weak when they are turned to the side. Not the case on this tank. Switching to premium ammo, which is in this case 265 APCR, pretty good for a tier 8 heavy, definitely nothing amazing but also not bad either. You can see nothing really changes on the tank's armor profile except when facing forward the upper plate becomes, well, slightly higher chance to penetrate than when using your standard ammo, but still you're very likely to bounce off this, as that is certainly not a 50-50 type of grey. So what do you need to know about this tank's armour? When you look at it, if you do indeed have enough penetration to go through this area, you have to try thread the needle. Avoid the sort of hull shoulders, avoid the upper plate below the gun, avoid the gun mantlet, because these areas are all very thick. In fact, the hull shoulders are 400 to 425 and this upper plate area is 425. Much more than any tier 8 or 9 tank is able to go through. So essentially you have to shoot here. Other than this, its cupola is quite weak and it is penetrable. It's not massive, but it is definitely something that can be penetrated, as you will see in the gameplay. And then of course the lower plate, which is actually quite annoying to deal with as it is narrow, kind of like a 60 TPs. But you can see this tank's armor profile is very good, and it is just a slight step above the tech tree tanks with being able to angle and, well, its overall weak points. And I'll very quickly look at this tank's armor profile. Let's say you did have a higher level of penetration, like the 300mm that the Centurion 7.1 is packing in tier 9. Well, you can see that you've got to avoid these areas on the outside, but because these side cheeks aren't weaker than the frontal hull, you can actually angle it to make the front stronger without these areas becoming too weak. And of course, let's say you put on enhanced armor, which this wasn't on just now, you can see it is quite an annoyance to deal with this tank's armor. Definitely more like a heavy tank armor profile. But next, let's talk about the gun. This tank mounts a 162mm gun, which is the biggest gun in tier 8 and almost the biggest gun in tier 9 as well. It shoots 100mm shells though, which does mean that despite it being a 162mm gun, you're only able to, well, have the same sort of gun characteristics as a 100mm gun due to your shells only being 100mm caliber shells. This means overmatching and stuff like that going through tracks will be a little bit more challenging than guns with high caliber, such as if you're used to a 120mm gun, this tank will definitely struggle a bit more going through tracks, overmatching, side scraping, that sort of thing. It does have the assault shell mechanic, meaning damage gets less the further away you are from enemies. So let's talk about that. At 50 meters, you have 3,400 DPM almost, with almost 520 alpha on your standard ammo. That is extremely impressive. In fact, it's completely overpowered when you are within this 50 meter range. You have a very fast reload, 9.2 seconds, for having 520 alpha damage and also 3,400 DPM. Not many tier 8 tanks have more DPM than this. Not even too many tier 8 tank destroyers have more DPM than this. However, 50 meters, that's the proxy spotting range, which means if you do want to use this alpha damage, you're not going to be able to set up an ambush or go unspotted or anything. At this range, you are always going to be spotted. But moving past that, up to 120 meters away from your enemy, your damage reduces to 444 with 2,900 DPM. This is still not bad. 2,900 DPM is very nice DPM, even for a tank destroyer in tier 8. Combine that with 444 alpha, which is still very good for a tank destroyer, and this tank is still very competitive at the 120 meter range, even though, yes, it's not quite as good as the 50 meter range, but it is still very good for tier 8 overall. Past 120 meters at the 200 meter range, you have a lot less impressive DPM at 2,400 and with only 370 alpha. At this sort of DPM range, you're more sort of competing with heavy tanks. Your reload time is good compared to heavy tanks, but your alpha damage at 370 is a bit less than a lot of them, and your DPM is only slightly more than a lot of heavy tanks. So at this range, you're not going to be doing anything super impressive or crazy, but you will still be able to out DPM a lot of heavy tanks that you'll face, but you might not out trade them with only 370 alpha damage. And then past 200 meters, you just don't want to be here. You do not want to be using this damage. Only 300 alpha damage with a 9-second reload is just terrible. Combine this and it becomes 1,900 DPM, which is also just terrible. So past 200 meters, you really just don't want to be there in this tank. If there are closer enemies, definitely go for them, just because your damage is just abysmal at 200 meters. Some other things to mention, of course, are the alpha damage. You can see it here. It does also decrease on your premium APCR. However, HE remains the same no matter what range you are at, which is pretty important. It means that if you're facing a hull down enemy at long range and they are really very hard to penetrate, your damage on premium APCR will only be 256 on average, and that is if you penetrate them. But let's say you load HE, it has 63mm of penetration, does 630 alpha, you still have a pretty decent chance of splashing them for 150 to 200 damage, and you're almost guaranteed to get that damage. So I would say personally for me, a lot of the time I'd rather use the HE at long range against an enemy I can't penetrate compared to the premium APCR. But let's talk about the actual ammo itself. It has double APCR and HE, of course, as its HE shell. The penetration, 243 on standard APCR, definitely not impressive on the lower end of tank destroyer penetration, but also not unusable, and it's not like a heavy tank, not quite. Premium APCR is proper tank destroyer penetration, 305mm, and of course it does have quite nice shell velocity at 1200 meters per second, which is definitely a significant step up from the rather mediocre 900 on standard. And then of course HE with 63mm of penetration. For a 100mm shell, this is very good, and for tank destroyers overall, it's not terrible. And of course, your reload time, 9.2 seconds. As discussed, this can be very good if you do have 518 or 444 alpha, or just pretty average with 370. So, of course, the reload time kind of depends on where you are fighting at for how effective it is. Next, the aim time is 4 seconds or 4.3 if you use refined gun, which is not impressive for a tank destroyer at all. However, It is sort of compensated by the good gun handling on move, which is 0.15 when you're moving, 0.18 when turning, and 0.08 when you're moving the gun, which, when it's all combined, is actually pretty nice gun handling. Aim time is 2.62 seconds, that is a typo, that should be a 6, which is not great for a tank destroyer at all, but again, slightly compensated by this nice gun handling. And of course, 0.353 dispersion, not great at all, but also not unusably bad. Especially at close range, your 518 alpha will be, well, it'll feel fine with that level of alpha damage. It's at the longer ranges where you do notice that rather unimpressive dispersion and aim time. And then of course, shell velocities, not impressive on standard APCR, decent enough on HE, but quite nice on your premium APCR. And then of course 7 degrees gun depression, which is an upgrade over all the tech tree tanks, which all have 6 degrees. So overall, this gun is actually really quite nice. And that is, of course, if you are playing it right. Most of the time, if you do play it right, you won't be having this 200 meter damage, and considering that, your average DPM is somewhere between 3,400 and 2,400. So it's definitely not terrible considering you're fighting on the front lines, you're generally facing heavy tanks, you've got good enough armor to go up against them, and for the most part you've got good alpha damage for trading, and in the best case scenario you've got just insane DPM and damage output. Combine that with the fact that at those relatively closer ranges your accuracy and penetration are not a terrible downside, then this gun overall is actually quite good, quite nice. But next, let's talk about the mobility. This tank does have a 35 km/h top speed, which is like a heavy tank, and that is completely justified considering its armor profile. Reverse speed is 13, which again is like a heavy tank. For a tank destroyer it's certainly not great, but I do believe it is slightly better than the tech tree tanks, which have 12. Next, its acceleration is 16.2, and its engine power is 776 for its 48-ton weight. Of course, on hard terrain it does have the same acceleration rate just due to its terrain resistance, and its traverse speed is 42.1 degrees, which is not terrible for a tank destroyer, especially considering how much armor this tank has. 42 is actually quite good. However, compared to faster tank destroyers, this 42 isn't anything crazy. Next, medium terrain performance. I do want to talk about this quite a bit, as it is quite important. If you go to Blitzkit and you look at the Polish tank destroyers, you'll notice some similar traits among all of them, and that is their terrain resistances. All the Polish tank destroyers from tier, I believe, 6 to 10, if I'll just grab them all, the Kilana, the Govika, and the Berza, and then let's get the Grom. Let's go down and look at its terrain resistance difference. So you can see here the terrain coefficient on all of these tanks is 1 on hard terrain and 1.5 on medium terrain, except for the Grom, which has 1.2. This does mean its medium terrain performance is significantly better than every other tank in the tech tree. You can see the difference being 13 horsepower per ton on medium terrain compared to the next best, which is the tier 10, at 10 horsepower per ton, and then all the rest have less than 10, even going down to 9. So this terrain resistance difference of 1.2 compared to 1.5 is enormous for this tank, and it is a massive advantage that you have on the Grom compared to the tech tree tanks. It does just mean that your mobility difference on medium terrain is not really that much worse than on hard terrain. You can see that here, 13.5 horsepower per ton acceleration and 35 degrees per second of traverse speed. We go back to the comparison, you can see traverse speed on this tank, it shows us 34, and then all the others have 27.7, 27.2, 27.4, 28.5, 30. so it is significantly more than the other tech tree tanks just due to this terrain resistance. So that is something not to be ignored, not to be overlooked. It makes a massive difference on this tank, even though you can't actually see it in game with its stats, as it just looks the same. But next, let's talk about this tank's consumables and equipment. So in terms of consumables, I would go with adrenaline, multi-purpose repair, and then repair kit. You do not need engine power boost because this tank doesn't have a high top speed, and it has quite good acceleration to be able to reach the top speed that it does have. Next, provisions, I'd just go with the normal setup. I haven't found a need for protective kit, as I haven't noticed any modules being particularly too weak. Next, equipment wise, I'd go with gun rammer. In fact, you should go with gun rammer. Do not use calibrated shells, you'd be absolutely insane to do that. If you're looking for a tank that has penetration, more penetration, just don't play a Polish tank destroyer, as all the Polish tank destroyers are about are getting out high damage in close range with a very good level of DPM and reload time for their alpha damage. So you want to be maximizing that with gun rammer. If you want more penetration, sell the Grom, sell all your Polish tank destroyers, go play some regular tank destroyer that has very high penetration, because if you're using calibrated on this tank, you may as well just not be playing it. Next, improved optics. 275 meters of V range is 10 meters more than every other tank destroyer from tier 8 to 10, almost. And the reason being, this tank plays on the front lines, and I think Wargaming doesn't want you to be sniping. Its camo rating is actually quite good, but you won't be sniping, so just use improved optics. Next, I would go with improved control, because when I was using engine accelerator on this tank, I did notice I had no issues reaching my top speed. However, sometimes the traverse speed would be a bit annoying because I'd need to go around a corner and quickly turn to get my gun on the heavy tank before it reverses out of range, and therefore having the better traverse speed would have been nice. So I've switched to improved control after playing the tank a fair bit. Next, improved assembly is not needed on this tank because this tank is all about the armor, and its base hit points of 1320 are actually already very good for a tank destroyer. I would go with enhanced armor because it does make a fairly notable difference on this tank. So here we can see against 300mm penetration from the Centurion, and then we switch to use enhanced armor. You can see it doesn't make the biggest difference here. However, do note 300mm is quite good for any tank you'll face, really, but it does make quite a bit of difference when you do turn the hull, which you can actually do in this tank as its shoulders aren't weak. So I would definitely use it, as it does just make a significant difference against the higher level of penetration that you might come against in tier 8 to 9, such as, well, high penetration tier 8 heavies, or just tier 9 mediums with the higher level of penetration such as 300. Next, gun lane drive, as this tank's aim time is poor, and despite it having unimpressive shell velocity on standard ammo for APCR, 900 meters per second definitely is not bad. And of course, considering you're playing in close range, it's not like you need very high shell velocity for the most part. The only times you'll need it are when you're sniping, and in this tank you should not ever be sniping as your damage output is just terrible. Next, I would go with the vertical stabilizer, but this is just my personal choice from playing the tank. I just found it to be more comfortable with the vertical stabilizer for me, having that slightly better gun handling, but you might find that refined gun with that permanent better dispersion does do better for you. Try out both, see which one works better for you. And then of course the final two would just go with the usual setup for these two. So I do have two battles. Well, let me first show you the camo for this tank. This is the legendary camo for the Grom. You can see it fits the theme of the whole tech tree, which all have fairly similar camouflages. Nice realistic appearance with some fake leaves and camo netting on the front. But I do have two battles in the Grom I do want to show you. So this first replay is going to be on Castilla, and in this battle it's not anything super crazy or impressive, but it does show the tank's mechanic quite well. So one thing you want to think about when you're playing this tank, probably the main thing you want to think about when you're playing this tank or any Polish tank destroyer, is which side of the map to go. And really, it doesn't matter too much, you just have to consider which side of the map has the closest range engagements. So me, on this map, I think that base C, the heavy side, generally heavy tanks are fighting across from each other. There's tank destroyers sniping you from hidden positions, so you're not really in the best position to really push forward and be really aggressive with a tank like this. So I'm going towards the base A area, where I can actually push up towards the base, and if anyone is actually at the base, they will be in quite close distance and I'll be able to use this tank's high damage mechanic on them. So that's what you'll see I'm doing here. You can also notice the mobility of this tank. Definitely not a slow tank, though its top speed does limit it. You can see here I do stop to take a shot on the Tiger 1, but of course because I was moving and this tank doesn't have super impressive accuracy stats, I do miss the shot. But now you can see I want to have Glacial, but look on my screen, you can see that bar above my rangefinder, and you can see that it was completely empty when I aimed at that 112 Glacial. I did bounce, but you'll see here again, I take a shot, 272 damage for a 9-second reload. Again, that's because of this tank's mechanic, where my average roll at that range is 296. So you can see in 2 shots I've done 548 to that 112 Glacial. Sure, they were a bit of low rolls, but you can see in 1 shot at 50 meters, I've done already 550 damage to that Tiger 1. So 1 shot in close range is worth essentially 2 shots at long range. You can see there, a second shot on the Tiger so quickly, doing a max roll of 647. This Tiger has gone from almost full HP to a 1 shot in just 9 seconds. Then the Glacial shoots me, causing me to of course be now a 1 shot. And unfortunately the Glacial is going to finish me off, and you'll see here I do have 1 bar on my damage thing, which does mean I do 370 damage on average, but you can see he does finish me off. Fairly lucky considering how small this tank's lower plate is. But in this one I did really just want to show the long range damage, because I generally did not get shots like that where I was shooting at such a long range. But you can see there 2000 damage, and I did make 80,000 credits without any boosters, which is pretty decent. Of course this is a tier 8 collector, so it does make pretty nice credits. You can see there 2200. Moving to the next replay, this one is going to be on Yamato Harbour, and unlike the previous replay, this one is all about the damage, and you'll see truly how powerful this tank really is when it does get going. So again, think about which side of the map has the shortest engagement distance, where has the closest fights. And for Yamato Harbour it is base A, where heavy tanks are pushing towards the base, sitting behind the bridge of Yamato and the gun turrets, and thus in fairly close range. So here I am following behind the AMX, and I do see the Tiger, but unfortunately it means I miss the Skoda, which I didn't notice was actually at such a close distance. But now I'm going to try and go for the Skoda. Unfortunately I'd like this position where the AMX 49 is, but his driving is just abysmal, and he's not letting me use the position, he's not letting me push out, and I don't have a turret, so I have to be a bit careful with how I poke. Luckily I do get a shot in, 500 damage, and then you can see I've activated Adrenaline, making my reload down to 7.9 seconds, and there we go, another 530 damage to the Skoda. He does put in a shot into me, and then unfortunately he turns his hull just enough to make his lower plate an auto ricochet angle, and I bounce off. But again, 9 seconds later I'm reloaded, and I do another 500 damage to the Skoda. So good trades, 3 damaging shots for 520 for 1 of 450. And now you'll see I'm going for the Tiger 1. I'm not going to shoot immediately even though he is in my reticle. I'm going to get within that damage range and do 490 to him. So you can see here the Tiger not even aiming for me just because my armor profile is really hard to deal with. But as playing this tank a fair bit, I've noticed the Tiger is at the perfect height to just shoot the cupola very easily, and the Tiger there does exactly that. But you can see here how aggressively I am playing this tank, and that's really how you want to be doing it. Obviously, not playing stupidly, not playing without care, but you do want to be playing this fairly aggressively. You've got armor, you may as well use it. You can see there, I was in the second damage range, so my average damage was 440, but I did max roll for 550, which is nice. And now the Bisonte has gotten in close enough range that I have my max damage, so doing another 500 damage there, and then a second one into the Bisonte there. You can see I was face hugging the Bisonte, meaning he could not penetrate my tank unless shooting my cupola or loading premium ammo, which evidently he didn't do either of those. So now there is a full health IS-2 shielded. I'm going to put in one shot, a bit of a low roll down to 456, but now seeing that I'm a one shot, the IS-2 does rush forward. Unfortunately there I do bounce off an odd angle on the IS-2, but luckily I stay alive thanks to him also bouncing off me. And here I'm just going to make sure I get the kill by loading premium ammo. Now here I'm seeing it's a very good battle, I could get more damage, but unfortunately the WZ6321 has good aim and hits my cupola, leaving me to end off with 4,944 damage for this battle. Unfortunately, not being able to continue further. However, in that battle, you can see I did do 4,900 damage with 1,000 blocked, and you can just see how this tank really plays, and of course making a good amount of credits due to it being a good battle. But you can see really how the Grom likes to play, and how it is just perfectly suited to being an aggressive vehicle. So, the Grom. Is this tank worth getting? Well, no, not at the moment, because the way this tank has released is in crates. And not just any crates, they are crates with a 3% drop chance instead of the normal 5, crates where it needs 39 charms instead of the usual 25 or 30, and of course they are also not for gold, they're only for money, so this tank is very expensive to get if you don't get lucky, so it is not worth getting at the moment. Of course, if you do know how to play tanks like this, the Polish tank destroyers with their special mechanic, you do like to YOLO in a bit and play aggressively, then you will enjoy the Grom and you will find it to be a very good tank, as that's what it is. However, that's not to say it's overpowered or it's, you know, the new best tank in tier 8, as it isn't really. It does balance itself out a little bit by having a fair few downsides in the accuracy department and of course damage at longer ranges. This is forced to only play in close range, and there is no flexibility in that playstyle. So it definitely is an interesting tank, a unique tank, but it's not anything insane compared to the tech tree vehicles. Yes, it does have some advantages in its terrain resistances, its gun depression, and compared to the tier 8, its alpha damage, but overall playstyle wise, they are fairly similar in how strong they are in battle. Tier for tier compared to the tier 10 and tier 9, it's still not too different with how they perform. So this tank, while it is a nice vehicle, it's nothing too crazy, and you can just wait for it to come back for gold, as the other tanks do play fairly similarly to it. And occasionally you will find some crazy person who is sitting in their bush camo at the back of the map in a bush and camping with this tank, and they will perform absolutely terribly. So this tank won't always be annoying when you do face it, but when it is a good player, the armor combined with the higher damage can be quite an annoying thing to deal with. But yeah, that is the Grom. If you got it, lucky you. I'm envious, I wish I had it. But yeah, thanks for watching, and if you do want this tank, just wait for it to come back for gold, as currently it is too expensive.